When Apollo 17 returned to Earth in December 1972, the United States did not celebrate the end of an era. There were no parades, no national addresses, no declarations of continuation. The silence was not accidental. Internally, NASA already knew that Apollo was finished. The decision had been made months earlier, long before the Saturn V lifted off for the final time. To understand why, you have to look at what Apollo had quietly become by the early 1970s, a program without a political enemy. The space race was never about exploration in the abstract. It was about demonstration. Each launch, each orbit, each footprint was a message aimed not at the moon, but at Moscow. By 1969, that message had been received. Intelligence assessments from the Nixon administration concluded that the Soviet Union could not realistically mount a crewed lunar landing in the foreseeable future. Their heavy lift capability was unreliable, their command structure fragmented, and their political appetite exhausted. Once that assessment circulated, Apollo lost its strategic value almost overnight. NASA engineers understood this shift before the public did. Internal correspondence from 1970 shows growing concern that the agency's future missions lacked a compelling narrative for Congress. Scientific return alone was not enough. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were canceled not because they were unsafe, but because they were redundant in the eyes of policymakers. The moon had been conquered symbolically. Additional landings offered diminishing political returns. One often overlooked detail: the hardware for these canceled missions already existed in partial form. Saturn V stages had been manufactured, command modules were in assembly, crews had begun preliminary training rotations. These were not theoretical missions, they were dismantled futures. At the same time, public perception of spaceflight was changing. Early Apollo missions had been broadcast as existential events. By Apollo 15, moonwalks were scheduled between regular television programming. Viewers changed channels. A 1971 internal NASA media analysis noted that extended lunar surface activity no longer holds mass audience attention unless framed as emergency or failure. That line mattered. Disaster, not discovery, held attention. The deaths of the Apollo 1 crew in 1967 had already shown how fragile public support could be. Each additional lunar mission carried the risk of catastrophe without the promise of transformative political gain. Risk without reward is poison for bureaucracies. Meanwhile, another program was waiting in the wings: the shuttle. Originally conceived in the late 1960s as part of an ambitious post-Apollo architecture, including space stations and Mars missions, the shuttle survived only by being simplified, downsized, and reframed. It was sold to Congress as economical, reusable, and routine. This framing was strategic. Unlike Apollo, the shuttle promised jobs in multiple states. Its components were distributed across congressional districts. Funding it meant funding local economies. Apollo had been centralized. The shuttle was political. From a technical standpoint, this shift marked a philosophical retreat. Saturn V had been over-engineered for reliability. It was expensive, disposable, and brutally effective. The shuttle, by contrast, was a compromise machine. It carried wings it rarely needed, reused components that required extensive refurbishment, and depended on systems operating close to failure margins. The decision to abandon the moon was not replaced by a leap forward. It was replaced by orbit. Low Earth orbit became the ceiling of human ambition for decades. On the Soviet side, the story unfolded differently, but ended in the same place. After repeated failures of the N-1 rocket, Soviet leadership quietly terminated their crewed lunar program in the early 1970s. The decision was not publicly acknowledged. Instead, they redirected resources toward space stations.
Salyut, and later Mir, were endurance machines. They demonstrated long-term human survival in space rather than symbolic conquest. This suited Soviet doctrine. While the United States pursued spectacle, the Soviet Union emphasized persistence. An internal Soviet military memorandum from 1974 described orbital stations as platforms for continuous strategic observation, a phrase that reveals far more about intent than public rhetoric ever did. By the mid-1970s, both superpowers had converged on the same conclusion from opposite directions. The Moon was politically quiet, strategically distant, and economically inconvenient. So they stopped going. What followed was not secrecy, but neglect. Lunar data collected during Apollo sat largely unanalyzed for years. Funding for sample studies declined. Younger scientists were steered towards Earth observation, planetary probes, and climate research. The Moon became archival. This abandonment created a psychological gap that later generations would struggle to understand. People asked a simple question: if we could go then, why didn't we keep going? The official answers, budget constraints, shifting priorities, geopolitical détente, were accurate but unsatisfying. They lacked drama. And where drama is absent, suspicion grows. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, distrust in government institutions surged across much of the Western world. Watergate, Vietnam, covert operations, and intelligence scandals reshaped public perception. Space agencies were not immune. A sociological study published in 1983 noted a rise in conspiracy thinking tied specifically to large-scale technological achievements that abruptly ended without clear successors. The moon landings fit that pattern perfectly. They were spectacular, they were expensive, and then they stopped. No hidden hand was required, just human psychology colliding with institutional silence. Meanwhile, the astronauts themselves returned to a world that had already moved on. Many Apollo astronauts struggled with reintegration, not because of trauma, but because nothing afterward could match the intensity of what they had experienced. Some returned to engineering, some to politics, some retreated entirely from public life. One astronaut described it simply: after you've seen the Earth whole, it's hard to care about quarterly reports. By the 1980s, a generation had grown up that had never watched a moon landing live. To them, Apollo felt less like history and more like mythology. And mythology, when stripped of context, invites distortion. In the next part, we'll examine how that distortion took shape, how technical ignorance, Cold War secrecy, and media simplification combined to create enduring myths about why we left the moon.
By the time the 1980s arrived, the moon landings were no longer living events. They were archive footage. That distinction matters. When an event passes out of living memory and into recorded memory, it becomes vulnerable, not to erasure, but to reinterpretation. The emotional weight fades first, then the context, finally the mechanics. Apollo suffered all three losses. Television had shown the landings live, but only a fraction of the raw material was ever rebroadcast. Hours of technical dialogue, long periods of silence, and routine surface tasks were edited down to a handful of iconic moments: a boot print, a flag, a sentence about one small step. The rest vanished into storage. By the late 1970s, many television stations no longer retained the equipment needed to replay the original Apollo telemetry recordings. Some tapes were reused, others degraded. This was not sabotage, it was standard broadcast practice at the time. Preservation was expensive, storage space was finite. The future did not yet value digital permanence. That technical reality later became a narrative weapon. People asked why original footage looked grainy,
why there were gaps, why some recordings were missing entirely. The answer was mundane. The suspicion was not. At the same time, public understanding of space technology declined. Apollo had been built by engineers trained in analog systems, slide rules, and redundancy through simplicity. By the 1980s, consumer electronics had exploded. People carried calculators more powerful than Apollo guidance computers. This created a false comparison. Observers assumed older technology must have been inferior. They struggled to reconcile the idea that less computing power could still achieve greater feats. What they missed was architecture. Apollo's guidance computer was weak by modern standards, but it was purpose-built. It did almost nothing except navigate. It had no operating system bloat, no background tasks, no graphical overhead. It did one thing reliably. That distinction rarely survives casual discussion. Meanwhile, Cold War secrecy fed misunderstanding. Many Apollo-era documents remained classified well into the late 20th century, not because of lunar secrets, but because they revealed missile guidance techniques, inertial navigation methods, and communications encryption shared with nuclear delivery systems. When those documents were finally declassified decades later, conspiracy narratives had already hardened. Releasing facts after suspicion has formed rarely dissolves belief. It often reinforces it. Another factor quietly shaped doubt: the absence of follow-up imagery. For decades, there were no high-resolution images of Apollo landing sites taken from lunar orbit, not because they were hidden, but because no spacecraft had been tasked to do so. Why photograph old landing sites when funding barely covered new missions? Only in the 2000s did lunar orbiters like Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter image descent stages, tracks, and equipment left behind. By then, disbelief had already become cultural. The timing mattered. A lesser-known detail, often overlooked: early conspiracy claims emerged not in fringe publications, but in mainstream paperback books marketed as investigative. These works framed skepticism as intellectual independence rather than denial. They asked questions without providing answers, which is rhetorically powerful. Questions feel honest, answers feel authoritative. Authority was deeply mistrusted in the post-Vietnam era. Hollywood unintentionally added fuel. Films portrayed space programs as either incompetent or deceptive. Cold War thrillers leaned heavily on secret failures and cover-ups. Fiction blurred with perceived plausibility. The moon became a stage for narrative projection. And then there was the silence of NASA itself. NASA did not aggressively counter conspiracy claims for years. Engineers considered them absurd. Responding felt beneath the institution. This was a mistake. Silence was interpreted not as confidence, but as avoidance. When rebuttals finally came, they were technical, detailed, and emotionally flat. They spoke to engineers, not audiences. Facts were presented without story, but belief lives in story. Another subtle factor: Apollo astronauts aged in public. As decades passed, the men who had walked on the moon became elderly. Some died, others withdrew. A few declined interviews. To skeptics, absence looked like evasion. To historians, it looked like mortality. Memory does not fight back. Meanwhile, the world itself changed. Space became normalized. Satellites were invisible infrastructure. Orbits filled quietly. Rockets launched routinely. When something becomes routine, its origins feel exaggerated in hindsight. People forget how extraordinary it once was. A sociological survey in the 1990s found that disbelief in the moon landings correlated strongly with younger age groups who had no personal memory of the Cold War. To them, the stakes felt imaginary. Why rush to the moon? Why spend so much? Why stop? Without lived context, the answers feel unsatisfying. But history does not require satisfaction. It requires sequence. And the sequence is clear. The moon was not abandoned because it was unreachable. It was abandoned because it was no longer urgent. In the next part, we'll shift focus away from belief and disbelief and towards something quieter but more revealing: what the moon missions actually changed on Earth, in industry, medicine, warfare, and daily life, often in ways never credited to Apollo at all.
When Apollo astronauts returned to Earth, they were greeted as heroes. But the moon itself was only part of the story. The spacecraft, the engineering, the logistics, those things shaped industries and everyday life in ways few recognized. The Saturn V, for instance, was not just a rocket. It was a demonstration of industrial orchestration at a scale previously unseen. Every stage, every weld, every fuel valve required coordination across hundreds of companies. One account suggests that Rocketdyne alone managed thousands of turbo pumps, each tested dozens of times before flight. That industrial network became a template. By the 1970s, manufacturing sectors in the United States began adopting similar quality control systems checklist. Redundancy and modular design borrowed directly from aerospace practices. On a quieter scale, Apollo accelerated computer miniaturization. Guidance computers had to weigh less than 30 kilograms, consume minimal power, and survive extreme vibration and temperature swings. That constraint pushed chip designers toward integrated circuits, in ways civilian markets only later felt. One lesser-known detail: the Apollo guidance computer ran at roughly 1 megahertz with 36 kilobytes of memory. Modern observers assumed this was trivial, but it forced engineers to write extremely efficient, reliable code. That discipline later influenced software for banking, aviation, and even early personal computers. Medical technology benefited too. The need to monitor astronauts remotely, record vital signs, and manage risks of radiation and microgravity created sensors and devices later adapted to hospitals. Telemetry techniques used to track heart rates on Apollo flights became prototypes for patient monitoring systems decades later. Even logistics, the movement of tons of fuel, oxygen, water, and food to remote launch facilities reshaped supply chain thinking. Apollo essentially ran small armies of trucks, cranes, and barges, coordinating just-in-time deliveries from multiple launch pads. Companies that supported NASA exported that expertise globally. Cultural memory of the moon sometimes ignores this. Terrestrial footprint, the shiny astronauts, the silver lunar surface, the photographs they capture imagination. The scaffolding beneath them rarely does. Education was another ripple. Science fairs, math curricula, engineering scholarships, and vocational programs all experienced sudden surges in the late 1960s and 1970s. Students could point to something tangible. Humans had walked on a world beyond their own. Motivation is subtle, but its effects are measurable. A lesser-known note: the pressure suits worn on Apollo were prototypes for modern firefighting and hazardous material suits. The layers of aluminized mylar, Nomex, and Teflon-inspired garments that protect against heat and chemical exposure. And yet, not all changes were celebrated. Military planners observed the dual-use potential of space technology: orbital reconnaissance, navigation, and missile guidance all gained credibility from Apollo's success. Investments that once seemed speculative were now justified. The moon was a stage, but earthbound stakes quietly shifted. Even culture shifted. Music, literature, film, and advertising suddenly included lunar references. Products were marketed as moon-tested or space-age. The moon became shorthand for cutting-edge and aspirational, detached from technical reality, but powerful in persuasion. Lesser-known detail: Apollo missions required over 400,000 engineers, technicians, and contractors at peak, yet only 12 men set foot on the moon. That ratio 1:2000 illustrates how human perception condenses enormous systems into singular icons. By the 1970s, the world had witnessed humanity leap off its home planet. But the social echoes: risk tolerance, problem-solving under constraint, and large-scale project management persisted quietly. Cities, industries, universities, even the organization of governments were touched by Apollo's invisible hand. And this is where the story of the last men on the moon intersects with the world they returned to. They landed in a society already transforming, yet barely aware of the transformation. Spaceflight promised limitless possibility, but Earth remained constrained. Economic pressures, political shifts, and cultural fatigue limited continuation. Apollo itself became a benchmark that was increasingly hard to justify for the astronauts. The return was disorienting. They had seen a world without borders, a horizon unbroken by politics or property. They returned to a society still defined by walls, paperwork, and small disputes. One account suggests that some astronauts struggled with restlessness, insomnia, and the slow pace of ordinary life after the intensity of lunar missions. Lesser-known detail: NASA maintained a formal debriefing system, not just for mission data, but for psychological readjustment. Notes show that flight surgeons advised astronauts on managing reintegration, emphasizing routine and social engagement. Yet the world did not slow down for them. Decisions about funding, political will, and public interest moved at a pace the moon's surface could not influence. By the mid-1970s, the era of active lunar exploration ended, not because it was impossible, but because the cost, risk, and public attention had shifted elsewhere. The final Apollo mission, Apollo 17, lifted off in December 1972. Gene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans returned not only as explorers, but as the last emissaries of a human venture that had already begun to fade from daily concern. When Gene Cernan left the lunar surface, he traced a final path across the regolith, leaving footprints that may endure for millions of years. But on Earth, his footsteps were less permanent. Society moved on. Funding shifted. Cultural attention dispersed. The moon remained, and with it, a record of achievement. But the world the astronauts returned to had already adapted in ways they would never fully see. Technology, culture, education, medicine, and military practice had all absorbed lessons from the lunar program, sometimes explicitly, sometimes invisibly. Lesser-known detail: the Apollo lunar module ascent engines were repurposed in testing for civilian jet engines. where engineers adapted the ignition sequence technology to improve safety during emergency. Power-ups. This dissonance between permanence on the Moon and impermanence on Earth defines the legacy of the last men who walked there. The story is not just about astronauts, rockets, or flags. It is about transformation, diffusion, and the subtle ways extraordinary achievement reshapes the ordinary world. It is astonishing how many persistent beliefs exist about the moon landings, some of them harmless, others stubbornly false. Humans love a story that simplifies the complex. The reality was never simple. First, the idea that the moon is a sterile desert that offered no challenge. Many assume Apollo astronauts simply walked across a barren, unchanging landscape. In truth, lunar geology was unpredictable. Dust was fine, pervasive, and abrasive. It infiltrated suits, boots, and equipment, scouring surfaces. Engineers discovered that lunar soil acted almost like sandpaper. In some tests, it wore down seals faster than any Earth-based material. Lesser-known detail, the lunar regolith clung so persistently that even after rigorous cleaning, traces remained in the lunar module's airlock for the entire mission. Second, the belief that the astronauts could see Earth clearly all the time is exaggerated. While the Earth was visible from the Moon, it appeared as a distant, rotating orb. Horizon visibility was limited by the low-angle terrain, craters, and lighting conditions. One account suggests that during Apollo 16, astronauts misjudged crater depths while driving the lunar rover, because shadows distorted perception. Third, many imagine zero gravity as effortless floating. That is not true. Lunar gravity is 1/6 of Earth's, which allows movement but also complicates balance. Jumping, stopping, or carrying equipment required constant adjustment. Some astronauts stumbled repeatedly, and tests had to be developed mid-mission to prevent damage to instruments and suits. Lesser-known detail, early lunar training underestimated the difficulty of moving across slopes. The astronauts had to improvise techniques to ascend crater rims safely. Fourth, the myth that Apollo missions were risk-free ignores the near disasters. Apollo 12 was struck by lightning shortly after launch, temporarily knocking out guidance systems. Apollo 13 experienced a critical oxygen tank explosion that nearly cost the crew their lives. These events highlight how meticulous redundancy and crisis training saved missions. Fifth, the notion that the Moon is quiet is misleading. While there is no atmosphere to carry sound, the surface is alive with subtle motion, vibrations from rover movements, thermal expansion of rock, and micrometeorite impacts produced measurable tremors. Lunar seismometers placed by Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 recorded these phenomena for years. Lesser-known detail, scientists discovered that the Moon rings like a bell after impacts, with seismic waves lasting far longer than similar events on Earth. Sixth, many think Apollo astronauts left nothing behind except footprints and flags. In reality, over 180 tons of hardware modules, tools, experiments, and even personal items remain on the lunar surface. Laser reflectors, installed for scientific measurement, continue to transmit data to this day. Seventh, the idea that Apollo inspired immediate global Space expansion is overstated. After Apollo 17, international interest in manned lunar missions waned due to cost and politics. Lunar exploration shifted toward robotic spacecraft, orbiters, and satellites. Yet Apollo's engineering standards informed those missions. Lesser known. Detail. Techniques developed for Saturn V stage separation were adapted directly in the design of interplanetary probes like Viking and Voyager. Eighth, some claim the missions were filmed in a studio. This myth ignores the overwhelming technical evidence: rock samples, radiometric dating, lunar seismometry, and thousands of photographs taken under unique lighting conditions impossible to replicate. Artificially in the 1960s, finally, the perception that astronauts were solitary heroes neglects the thousands behind them. Flight directors, engineers, technicians, ground controllers, scientists, and contractors created the conditions for success. Estimates vary, but over 400,000 people contributed directly to Apollo. One astronaut noted that the moon was our stage, but Earth was a city-sized machine of support beneath us. Every myth simplifies, but simplification erases the subtle interplay of risk, engineering, human psychology, and planetary science. Understanding what was real makes the achievements far more impressive. When Apollo astronauts returned to Earth, they were greeted as heroes, but the moon itself was only.
The defining moment came in December 1972. Apollo 17 lifted off from Earth, carrying the last humans to set foot on the lunar surface. The crew, Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans, descended into the Taurus Littrow Valley, a region of jagged mountains, deep craters, and shadowed plains. Every step they took was laden with consequence. Every drill hole, every rock sample, every photographic frame represented thousands of hours of preparation, testing, and human ingenuity. Lesser-known detail, the lunar rover used on Apollo 17 had a top speed of just 11 miles per hour, but precise driving across slopes and crater rims required split-second judgment, a level of skill that astronauts developed only after hundreds of hours of simulated terrain practice on Earth. Cernan's final steps on the moon were emblematic. Before leaving, he knelt, took a last look at the horizon, and left a simple message etched in the dust, a farewell to the moon and, quietly, to the era of human lunar exploration. Schmitt, a geologist, collected rocks that would illuminate the moon's volcanic past and contribute to understanding the solar system's history. Every experiment left behind, every instrument deployed, became part of a hidden network of scientific inquiry, still sending data back to Earth decades later. The aftermath of Apollo 17 and the Apollo program as a whole was profound but subtle. On the one hand, political and financial pressures curtailed further manned lunar missions. The enormous costs, the risk of human life, and shifting priorities toward Earth orbit and robotic exploration meant humanity would not return to the moon for decades. Lesser-known detail, NASA had detailed plans for Apollo 18, 19, and 20, including lunar bases, but budget cuts and political decisions canceled them before a single astronaut could board the rockets. On the other hand, the program left a lasting legacy in engineering, science, and culture. Saturn V rockets became the blueprint for heavy-lift launch vehicles. Techniques for life support, navigation, and computer control influenced space stations and interplanetary probes. The moon itself became a laboratory,
offering clues about planetary formation, volcanic history, and the solar system's bombardment record. Apollo also left a quieter human legacy. The missions proved that coordinated effort, precision engineering, and courage could take ordinary people far beyond Earth. They left behind not just footprints and flags, but an enduring testament to human curiosity and resilience. Lesser-known detail, laser reflectors placed by Apollo astronauts continue to provide millimeter-accurate measurements of the Earth-Moon distance, helping refine models of tidal acceleration and planetary motion. Today, as we look back, the Moon seems smaller, almost familiar, yet the world the astronauts returned to had already moved on. Technology raced forward, society shifted, and space exploration became more automated. And yet, the shadow of Apollo lingers. It is a reminder that even fleeting moments, walking in low gravity, digging into ancient dust, waving farewell to the horizon, can echo across decades, shaping science, imagination, and ambition. The last men to leave the Moon did not merely return from a journey of miles, they returned from a journey of human possibility, a fragile window in time that may not open again for generations. And as the lunar dust settles untouched on the surface, one cannot help but wonder, when humanity finally returns, what will we see differently? And what will the Moon teach us next that we could not yet imagine? The silence of the lunar plains endures, quiet, haunting, and unbroken, a mirror to the stillness of time, and a reminder that some achievements, no matter how celebrated, belong forever to the landscape of memory and the sweep of history.